The Porsche was parked in the last spot in the parking lot, far from the main entrance, as if it wanted to go unnoticed. The silver-grey paint showed clear signs of age, small scratches on the bumper, almost invisible marks on the sides, and slight wear on the hood's clear coat. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make anyone stop to take a picture. For most people hurrying through the San Diego Automotive Center that morning, it was just another old car. Beautiful, yes, but common among so many sports cars that crisscrossed California's roads. Manufactured in 1989, that Porsche 911 Carrera seemed like just another survivor from an era when cars were still analog, noisy, and full of personality. But anyone who looked more closely would notice something strange. Despite its age, it didn't appear to have been restored. There were no exaggerations, no visible modernizations, no ostentation. Everything there seemed preserved. On the other side of the parking lot, Mark Reynolds watched the car in silence. Mark wasn't just any curious person. At 48, he had worked for over 2 decades as an independent appraiser of classic vehicles. He had seen it all. Ferraris disguised to look original, muscle cars with fabricated histories, ordinary Porsches sold as rare editions. His eye was trained to be suspicious. And something about that car bothered him. Not what it showed, but what it hid. As he slowly walked toward the Porsche, Mark noticed details that most would overlook. The original Fuchs wheels, with minimal signs of wear but no recent polishing. The slightly wrinkled black leather interior, with the steering wheel showing wear precisely where hands normally rest. Nothing there seemed artificial. Nothing seemed to have been prepared for sale. The owner was not yet present. The car had been left there early, according to the attendant at the auto center, by a gentleman who didn't give many explanations. He only said that he needed a complete evaluation without any rush. Mark opened the driver's side door. The smell that escaped from the interior wasn't that of a new car or a recent restoration. It was the smell of time, aged leather, sun-warmed metal, old oil. He sat in the seat and for a moment remained still, absorbing the sensation. The simple dashboard, the analog gauges, the centrally located tachometer, everything was exactly where it should be. He turned the key. The Boxer engine roared to life with a dry, firm sound, without any hesitation. There was no excessive smoke, nor strange vibrations. The car seemed healthy. Very healthy for a vehicle over 30 years old that, according to preliminary records, had never undergone a complete restoration. That didn't make sense. From a financial standpoint, that Porsche should be worth a respectable amount, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, something told Mark that this story wasn't simple. Cars like that don't survive intact for decades without a reason, or without a very specific owner. As the engine warmed up, Mark noticed an almost invisible detail, a small, faded sticker in the lower corner of the windshield. It wasn't from a dealership. It wasn't from an automotive event. It was a simple sticker with faded lettering that seemed to indicate the name of a deactivated military base in Arizona. That changed everything. In the United States, especially between the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was common for high-ranking officials to buy European sports cars, but almost always these vehicles were resold, modified, or lost to time. Very few remained with their original owners, and even fewer survived decades without ending up on the speculative market. Mark turned off the engine and slowly got out of the car. As he closed the door, he had the unsettling feeling that the Porsche wasn't just an object, it was a vestige, a silent fragment of something bigger. Minutes later, an elderly man approached through the parking lot. He walked slowly, leaning lightly on a cane. He wore simple clothes, a light shirt, old jeans, worn shoes. Nothing about him matched the stereotype of a Porsche collector. When he got close to the car, he stopped beside it for a few seconds, as if he were saying goodbye. "It's him," she said finally, in a calm voice. Mark turned to the man. There was something in his gaze that didn't match the simplicity of his appearance. It wasn't ordinary nostalgia. It was restraint, like someone accustomed to not saying everything he knows. "Are you the owner?" Mark asked. The man nodded slowly. "I am, since I was young." The answer was simple, but it carried enormous weight. Mark felt a slight shiver. A 1989 Porsche 911, bought new, kept by the same owner for over 30 years, with no apparent restoration, no visible modifications. That was already rare. But the way the man spoke suggested that the car hadn't just been well cared for, it had been protected. "He seems ordinary," Mark said, choosing his words carefully. "But he's not." The man flashed a discreet, almost imperceptible smile. "It never was," he replied. "He only learned to appear to be." At that moment, Mark understood that he wasn't dealing with a simple automotive appraisal. That Porsche carried a history that wasn't in the documents, the chassis numbers, or the maintenance records. It was a story tied to decisions, secrets, and choices made in a specific era in the United States, an era when some things needed to remain silent. And that car, parked there, was one of the few pieces of evidence that all of that really happened. The owner's name was Daniel Harper. Mark discovered this a few minutes later, when he checked the original documents that the man had carefully removed from an old leather folder, already softened from use. There was no modern plastic cover, nor organizing folders. They were papers kept like someone who never imagined he would need to prove anything to anyone. Daniel was 73 years old. Born in Flagstaff, Arizona, he had spent much of his adult life away from home. He didn't talk much about his past at first, but small details slipped out as time went on. The kind of details that only come to light when someone isn't trying to impress. The Porsche wasn't an impulsive purchase. In 1989, Daniel was stationed at an airbase in the Nevada desert. It was a strange time in the United States. The end of the Cold War was approaching, but no one yet trusted the silence of the other side. The tension was no longer in the headlines, but it remained present in discreet decisions, far from the public eye. The car had been ordered months earlier, not from a regular dealership, but through an authorized intermediary who handled imports specifically for military personnel on duty. The model was standard, officially, a 911 Carrera, manual transmission, nothing that would raise suspicion in customs reports or records. The choice of color, silver gray, wasn't aesthetic, it was strategic. Mark noticed this as he walked around the car, now with Daniel beside him. Every choice seemed to have been made to avoid standing out. No special emblems, no rare visual packages. Even the exhaust followed the most discreet configuration possible for the time. "Have you ever thought about restoring it?" Mark asked, looking at the right side panel. Daniel shook his head. "Restoring means erasing the trace," he replied. "And this car was never meant to disappear, only to go unnoticed." That said much more than it seemed. The Porsche's interior reinforced the same logic. No modern radio. The original system remained, even if it was rarely used. The dashboard didn't have the cracks common in cars of that age, but it didn't look new either. It was honest wear and tear, consistent with decades of careful, not sporadic use. Mark began to understand that the car hadn't spent years forgotten in a garage. It had been used, but used intentionally. The mileage records confirmed this. There were no long periods of inactivity. Year after year, the Porsche covered similar distances. Not too much, not too little. Always enough to keep everything running perfectly. Always under the radar. Daniel didn't talk much about his career, but some pieces fell into place. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a mechanic. His technical knowledge came from necessity. He knew exactly what to listen for in the engine, when to replace parts before they failed, and when not to attract attention in the wrong workshops. In the 1990s, when most sports car owners sought maximum performance, Daniel kept everything original. When the classic car market exploded in the 2000s, he ignored purchase offers that would make anyone hesitate. The Porsche was never for sale. Not for money, not for status. "This car took me to places where I couldn't leave a trace," Daniel said at one point, almost as a casual comment, "and it brought me back when nobody needed to know where I'd been." Mark didn't insist. He learned early on that some stories unfold on their own, if you give them space. The setting also helped tell part of the story. In the United States, especially in the Southwest, long deserted roads have always been allies of those who needed to move unnoticed. An overly sporty Porsche would attract attention. An ordinary car wouldn't have enough performance. That 911, seemingly unremarkable, occupied exactly the perfect middle ground. Fast when needed, invisible when convenient. Daniel had moved to California in the early 2000s, not for luxury, but for anonymity. In big cities, old cars go unnoticed. The Porsche became just another one among many, parked on busy streets, blending into the urban routine. Even so, Daniel maintained strict habits. He never left the car at unfamiliar repair shops. He never advertised it at car meets. He never spoke of it as something special. The car wasn't a trophy. It was a tool that had survived the test of time. Mark felt a strange weight as he listened to all of that. Evaluating cars was his job, but this defied any price list. How could he put a price on something that had been a silent part of decisions that no one had ever officially recorded? While jotting down observations, Mark noticed something that completed the circle. The chassis showed no irregularities. The engine matched the original number exactly. Nothing had been altered, but small internal marks, almost invisible, indicated careful disassembly, done by someone who knew exactly how to put everything back together without leaving a trace. These weren't modifications. They were inspections, checkups, adjustments made not to improve the car, but to ensure it would never fail when it mattered most. Daniel watched everything in silence. He showed neither anxiety nor pride. He simply waited. "Why now?" Mark finally asked. "After all these years, why ask for an evaluation?" Daniel took a while to reply. "Because some stories no longer need to remain hidden," he said. "And because this car has already served its purpose." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, laden with time. Mark carefully closed his notebook. For the first time in many years, he realized that this appraisal wouldn't just change the market value of an old Porsche. It would open a door. And once opened, it would no longer be possible to pretend that this car was just ordinary. The Porsche appraisal began to have an effect even before it was completed. Mark realized this in the following days, when he received calls that didn't make sense at first glance. Collectors didn't usually seek appraisers before a car was officially put up for sale, but 2 contacts arrived in less than 48 hours. Neither of them directly mentioned the 1989 911. Both asked questions that were too vague to be a coincidence. Daniel, for his part, continued with his routine. He took the Porsche for short trips, always at different times, always via alternative routes. Mark noticed this when he looked at the odometer and compared it to the old records. It was an old habit, not a recent behavior. The car wasn't just maintained, it was monitored. The conflict began to take shape when a seemingly trivial technical detail caught Mark's attention during a more thorough inspection. Upon removing part of the interior lining of the front trunk, he found fastening marks that were not present in the original Porsche diagrams. Nothing that altered the vehicle's structure, but enough to indicate that at some point something had been installed there and removed with extreme care. Mark didn't comment immediately. He wrote it down. He photographed it. He kept it to himself. In the United States, especially in the late 1980s, it was not uncommon for civilian vehicles to be used unofficially in transportation operations. Not as special cars, but as discrete platforms. The Porsche, fast and reliable, would be ideal for this. Still, that level of care indicated something beyond simple transport. The antagonism began to manifest itself subtly. There were no declared villains, nor direct threats. There was pressure. A short email arrived in Mark's inbox without a clear signature, asking about a recently evaluated European vehicle, year 1989. The message didn't ask for details, only confirmation. Mark ignored it. The next day, Daniel arrived earlier than planned. He was noticeably more attentive, though he maintained a calm demeanor. The Porsche was remarkably clean for someone who had only used it for city driving. This wasn't vanity. It was preparation. "Some stories don't like to be stirred up," Daniel said, watching the car, "even when they seem forgotten." Mark understood the warning, even without an explicit threat. The conflict wasn't between specific people. It was between past and present, between silence and exposure. Meanwhile, Mark began investigating on his own, not out of professional curiosity, but instinct. He cross-referenced dates, military bases, declassified public records. Nothing pointed directly to Daniel Harper. But there were gaps, periods where documents simply didn't exist. Unregistered transfers, administrative missions that were too long to be truly administrative. The Porsche would emerge in those intervals like an invisible constant. Mark's internal conflict was growing. His work had always been technical, objective, assessing value, condition, authenticity. But that car called everything into question. Revealing too much could expose something Daniel had spent his life trying to keep under control. Revealing too little would be a professional lie. The world around them was also beginning to close in. A man appeared at the auto center asking for the appraiser. He didn't introduce himself as a buyer. He only said that he represented private interests. Mark refused to talk. The man didn't insist. He just observed the Porsche for a few seconds longer than usual before leaving. Daniel realized. "It's not the first time," he commented later. "When something sits still for too long, someone always tries to pull the cloth." The main conflict was now clear. The car was not just a relic, it was a point of convergence. A piece that, if displayed in the wrong way, could reopen stories that were never officially closed. And then there was the emotional conflict. Daniel was beginning to show signs of fatigue, not physical, but mental. Maintaining silence for decades requires energy. Energy that is depleted over time. "I don't want to sell it," he said at one point, "but I also don't want it to become a false legend." Mark understood the dilemma. If the Porsche were sold as an ordinary car, its true story would die with Daniel. If it were sold as something too special, it would attract unwanted attention. The conflict escalated when Mark received an anonymous document in his office. It was an old, poorly scanned copy, referencing a civilian vehicle used in unofficial logistics operations in the southwestern United States between 1989 and 1993. The model wasn't mentioned, the driver's name was redacted, but the partial chassis number matched the Porsche. That was no coincidence, it was a warning. Mark realized he was already too involved to simply back down. The story was moving forward, whether he wanted it to or not. And the further it moved forward, the clearer it became that that ordinary Porsche was just the surface of something that someone somewhere preferred to keep buried. The conflict was no longer just in Daniel's past, it was in Mark's present, and the next step, whatever it might be, would have irreversible consequences. As the Porsche story quietly unfolded, new layers began to form around Daniel and Mark, never straying from the central theme. Nothing appeared by chance. Each small subplot seemed to exist only because that car was still there, intact, resisting the passage of time. The first of these layers came from Ethan Cole, a former colleague of Mark's. Ethan now worked for a company specializing in historical consulting for major collectors. Officially, he helped verify the authenticity of rare vehicles. Unofficially, he knew how to navigate gray areas where incomplete documents became a bargaining chip. Ethan contacted Mark in a way that was too casual to be innocent. "I heard you've got something interesting," he said during a brief phone call. A car that's not seen around very often. Mark dodged the question. He talked about ordinary work, routine evaluations. Ethan didn't press the issue, but made it clear he knew more than he was letting on. The subplot wasn't about friendship. It was about self-interest. And self-interest, in that environment, always came with consequences. Another thread began to form within Daniel's own past. Small memories escaped, not in the form of confessions, but of habits difficult to break. He continued to avoid certain places. He continued to park the Porsche always with the car pointed towards the exit. He continued to observe reflections before getting into the vehicle. These behaviors were not recent paranoia. They were reflections of decades of behavior. Mark realized this when Daniel refused to leave the car during a nighttime inspection requested by a third party. He wasn't aggressive. He simply said no. No justifications. No negotiation. Some things don't stay alone, he explained. Time also began to exert pressure. Daniel had recently received a medical notification. Nothing urgent, but enough to remind him that he didn't have decades left. The subplot of mortality entered the story without dramatization. It was a silent clock, ticking away. Meanwhile, Porsche was beginning to attract attention beyond the automotive world. A university researcher contacted Mark asking for information about civilian vehicles used in unconventional logistics at the end of the Cold War. Mark refused again. Each refusal increased the weight of what was being avoided. The most delicate subplot, however, arose from something unexpected: Daniel's son. Daniel didn't talk about it, not out of estrangement, but for protection. His son, Thomas, lived in Northern California, far from that past. He didn't know the car's full story. For him, the Porsche had always been just his father's old car. When Thomas showed up unannounced, everything changed. He didn't come because he was interested in the vehicle. He came out of concern. Daniel was getting old, and the car, in his son's eyes, represented a financial risk, an unnecessary responsibility. "You don't need that anymore," Thomas said calmly. "Nobody will miss it." Daniel didn't answer. The silence spoke volumes more than any explanation could. Mark watched this dynamic with discomfort. The family subplot didn't create direct conflict, but it added complexity. Selling the car could simplify Daniel's life. Keeping the car preserved something that no one else seemed to understand. The Porsche thus became a point of tension between generations. For Daniel, it was memory and function. For Thomas, it was useless past. For Mark, it was a professional and ethical enigma. And then there was the market. A major auction was approaching in Monterey. Rumors were circulating about a Porsche that was too original to appear. Mark knew he hadn't announced anything. Someone was talking. This external pressure accelerated everything. Time began to compress. Decisions that could previously be postponed now demanded a response. The final subplot unfolded almost invisibly. A small mechanical detail, nothing serious, a different sound when downshifting, something any ordinary mechanic would ignore. Daniel noticed it immediately. He asked to check it, not because I feared a problem, but because I knew that car always gave warnings beforehand. In a way, Porsche was also part of active history, not as something mystical, but as an extension of the human decisions that shaped it. Everything now converged. Old friendships, family, the market, institutional past, and time itself. The subplots didn't derail the narrative. They tightened the noose. Mark understood that the next step wouldn't be technical. It would be a choice. And choices, in that context, never came without a cost. The turning point didn't come in the form of a direct confrontation, nor a dramatic revelation that was announced. It began with something too small to be ignored and too serious to be treated as a coincidence. Mark received an envelope in the regular mail. No return address, no logo. Inside, there were only 3 things: an old photograph, a sheet of technical notes, and a short, handwritten note. The photograph showed a silver-grey Porsche 911 parked on a deserted road. In the background, rock formations typical of Arizona. The date, stamped on the back, indicated 1991. The framing was not accidental. Whoever took that photo knew exactly what they were capturing and why. The technical data sheet contained torque measurements, operating temperatures, and observations on engine behavior during long, continuous journeys. It wasn't a factory report. It was something done in the field, by someone who depended on that car. The note simply said, "Some things work better when nobody asks how." Mark felt a slight chill in his stomach. This wasn't a direct threat. It was confirmation. Someone knew, always knew, and was watching. He didn't show the envelope to anyone that day, but that night, while reviewing his old notes, he realized something that completely changed the course of the story. The Porsche hadn't just been used for commuting. It had been tested, evaluated, tuned as part of something bigger, not an isolated operation, but a pattern. The next day, Daniel showed up unannounced. "We need to talk," he said, even before sitting down. Mark placed the envelope on the table without saying anything. Daniel looked at the contents for a few seconds. He showed no surprise. He simply closed his eyes for a moment longer than usual. "So it came to you," he murmured. There, the silence was broken. Not by lengthy explanations, but by careful confirmations. Daniel didn't go into operational details. He didn't mention names or missions. He only made it clear enough for Mark to understand the true scope of what he was evaluating. The Porsche was more than just a means of transportation. It was part of a logic of silent movement, used in a specific period when unofficial routes needed to be fast, reliable, and above all, invisible. The car was chosen precisely because it seemed too ordinary to arouse suspicion and too sophisticated to fail. He was never special on the outside, Daniel said. He needed to be trustworthy on the inside. The central revelation came next. The Porsche wasn't unique. Others existed. But almost all were dismantled, sold, or had their original features altered after that period ended. Daniel survived because he never allowed it to be updated. Each original part was a guarantee that its history remained intact. That changed everything. Mark understood that if that story came to light in the wrong way, the car would cease to be a historical vestige and become a political problem, even decades later. At the same time, hiding it completely meant erasing a real, albeit uncomfortable, chapter of recent United States history. The turning point wasn't just informative, it was ethical. Daniel, for the first time, showed doubt. "I always knew how to protect the car," he said, "but I never knew what to do with the story." At that moment, Mark's phone rang. Unknown number. He didn't answer. Minutes later, a message appeared. "The Monterey auction is approaching. Some narratives don't belong to the public." There was no more room for neutrality. The Porsche had ceased to be merely an object of appreciation. It had become a point of decision. To reveal it partially, to remain completely silent, to transfer the story to someone who would know how to keep it safe. Daniel took an unexpected step. He gave Mark a small, old, unmarked metal keychain. "This opens up something I've never used," he said. "I thought I'd never need it." Mark didn't ask what. "I knew that from that moment on, the story had crossed an irreversible line. The car, the appraisal, and the choices made afterward would affect more than just the market value of a 1989 Porsche. From that point on, any decision would redefine the meaning of that car forever. Nothing visibly changed in the following days. The Porsche remained parked in the same discreet location. Daniel maintained his routine, and Mark continued working on other evaluations. But normality was now only an appearance. The turning point had altered the internal logic of everything. Mark couldn't ignore the weight of the keychain Daniel handed him. The object was simple, heavy, made of metal darkened by time. It had no inscriptions, no immediate clues. Still, he knew it wasn't symbolic. It was functional. And the fact that Daniel had never used it spoke volumes. The first consequence came in the form of external silence. The messages ceased. No suspicious calls. No vague emails. This kind of quiet, Mark knew, rarely meant giving up. It meant reorganization. Daniel, on the other hand, began to change small habits. He no longer drove the Porsche every day. He started leaving it parked for short periods, something he had never done before. It wasn't negligence, it was calculation, like someone who understands that sometimes moving around too much attracts attention. The relationship between father and son was also impacted. Thomas noticed that something was different. His father seemed more attentive, less patient with practical arguments. When Thomas again suggested selling the car, Daniel responded directly for the first time. "He's not for sale," he said, "and it's not for money." The sentence brought the conversation to a close, not out of authority, but out of finality. Thomas felt there was something he hadn't been told and decided not to press the issue. Mark decided to investigate the locksmith. He opened something that wasn't on public records, a small compartment hidden behind the interior lining of the garage where Daniel kept his car. There were no weapons, no incriminating documents. Just a narrow metal safe, perfectly adapted to the space. Inside, there were old magnetic tapes, sealed envelopes, and a technical notebook. The tapes contained records of movements, times, routes, and observations about the vehicle's behavior under different conditions. They weren't confessions. They were data, cold, objective data, but data that told a complete story to anyone who knew how to read it. The most serious consequence was not the content, but the realization. All of that had been deliberately preserved, not out of nostalgia, but out of responsibility. Daniel wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting an entire context. Mark realized that he was now also a part of it. By accessing that material, he had become a link. There was no going back. Meanwhile, rumors in the automotive market continued to grow. The Monterey auction was approaching, and parallel stories emerged about an untouched Porsche that could redefine values. None of them touched on the truth, but each rumor drew more curious onlookers. Daniel reacted practically. He asked Mark to complete the evaluation, but with clear limits. No historical references, no suggestive adjectives, only technical facts. State of preservation, mechanical originality. "If anyone asks, that's all it is," he said, "a well-maintained car." This decision had immediate consequences. Collectors lost interest, historical consultants backed away, Porsche became invisible again, at least on the outside. Internally, however, the tension was mounting. Mark was now carrying information he couldn't share and decisions he couldn't postpone. He began to question his own role. Evaluating that car without context was technically correct, but ethically incomplete. The ultimate consequence came in the form of an imminent choice. Daniel revealed that he was considering donating the Porsche to a specific institution. Not a traditional museum, but a private historical archive specializing in sensitive materials. A place where the car would not be displayed, but preserved. "Some stories don't need to be seen," Daniel said. "They just can't be lost." Mark understood. That would bring the cycle to a close. The car would leave the market, the realm of speculation and public curiosity. It would remain in existence, silently. But this choice also meant that Mark would have to take an active role. He would be responsible for ensuring that the transition occurred smoothly, without leaks, without misinterpretations. The consequences were in place. The past had reacted. The present was adjusting. And the future demanded a clear decision. Nothing there was dramatic on the surface. But everything was permanent. Mark's overcoming this didn't come as a heroic gesture or an impulsive decision. It came in the hardest way, accepting that his role in that story wasn't neutral and never had been. For years, he had built his career on emotional distance, to assess, record, estimate, without involvement, without judgment. The 1989 Porsche that now lay silently in Daniel's garage demanded something different. It demanded responsibility. Mark started with what he knew best: organization and clarity. He spent days reviewing every technical detail of the car, cross-referencing information, eliminating any ambiguity. The final report wasn't short, but it was precise. Not a single word was superfluous. Not a single word was missing. It was a document that said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. This discipline was his first step in growth. He learned that omitting something isn't lying when silence protects something greater. Daniel also underwent a silent transformation. For the first time in decades, he began to talk about the car without tension. He didn't reveal secrets, but shared neutral memories: empty roads, cold dawns, the constant sound of the engine at steady revs. They weren't confessions, they were gradual farewells. The Porsche was no longer just a tool of the past. It had become a consciously closed chapter. The relationship between father and son also evolved. Thomas realized that insisting on the sale was useless, but more than that, he realized that the car represented something he never needed to fully understand in order to respect. For the first time, he didn't try to change his father's decision. He simply asked if he could help. This simple change marked real growth. There was no dramatic reconciliation, just acceptance. Mark faced his greatest challenge when he refused a concrete offer. A collector offered an absurd amount for the Porsche, even without seeing it in person. The refusal wasn't strategic. It was ethical. As he hung up the phone, Mark felt something new: relief. He understood that not everything of value needs to be negotiated. Growth also came in the form of preparation. Mark helped Daniel organize the transfer of the car to the historical archive. Everything was done discreetly. No announcement, no ceremony, just efficient logistics. The Porsche underwent one last inspection, not to shine, but to ensure it would arrive at its destination intact. Every screw tightened, every fluid checked, every detail respected. During this process, Mark realized something fundamental. The car no longer symbolized secrecy. It symbolized closure. Daniel watched everything calmly. There was no regret in his eyes, only the tranquility of someone who finally understands that preserving privacy is also a way of telling the truth, even if in silence. On the last day, Daniel asked to drive the Porsche alone. It wasn't a nostalgic gesture. It was a personal ritual. One last short drive through the same ordinary streets where the car had always gone unnoticed. When he returned, he turned off the engine and remained for a few seconds with his hands on the steering wheel. Then he got out, closed the door, and handed the key to Mark. "Now he's not mine anymore," she said, "and that's a good thing." There, complete overcoming was achieved. There was no longer any functional attachment, only respect for what had been experienced. Mark felt that he had changed as well. He was no longer just an evaluator. He had become the temporary guardian of something that demanded maturity, not ambition. Growth wasn't about knowing more. It was about knowing when to stop. The build-up to the climax wasn't marked by visible urgency, but by a succession of precise, almost surgical decisions. Everything needed to happen without noise, without mistakes, without leaving unnecessary traces. That was the only way to end the Porsche story the right way. Mark took charge of the process with a focus he had never had before. Each step of transferring the car to the private historical archive was planned as if it were a delicate logistical operation, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for the nature of what was being preserved. The Porsche could not simply be transported like an ordinary vehicle, not because it was financially valuable, but because it carried layers of meaning that demanded absolute care. The destination did not appear on public maps. It was a discreet facility, maintained by a foundation specializing in preserving sensitive materials from the recent history of the United States. There was no public exhibition, guided tours, or explanatory plaques. The goal was not to show, but to preserve. Daniel watched everything from a distance. He had already emotionally said goodbye to the car. Now his role was simply to ensure that nothing was rushed beyond what was necessary. Haste, he knew, had always been the enemy of silence. Meanwhile, the last subplots began to unravel. Ethan Cole tried to contact him again. The message was too direct to ignore. If that car disappears, some people will wonder why. Mark replied with just one sentence. Some things disappear because they have served their purpose. There was no reply. That line of reasoning ended there. The automotive market, in turn, moved on. The Monterey auction took place without the Porsche. Other cars stole the spotlight. Records were broken. Headlines appeared, and amidst the noise, the silence surrounding the 1989 911 became absolute, total invisibility, exactly as it had always been. Thomas also found his place in that transition. He helped his father organize the garage, sort through old objects, and close practical cycles. He didn't ask about the archive, nor about the exact fate of the car. For the first time, he understood that some inheritances are not passed down through possession, but through choice. The most delicate moment came the night before the transport. Mark went to the garage for one last check. The Porsche was there, motionless, in the dim light. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. He lightly ran his hand over the bodywork, not as an emotional gesture, but as a final confirmation. The car was ready. Daniel showed up shortly after. It wasn't planned. He simply felt he needed to be there. The two stood in silence for a few minutes, gazing at the Porsche as if observing something that no longer fully belongs to them. "You know," Daniel said finally, "that after tomorrow, nobody will connect this to me anymore." Mark nodded. "And that's exactly what makes it complete," he replied. In that brief conversation, the true climax began to take shape. Not in the action, but in the intention. The decisive moment would not be a chase, nor a public revelation. It would be the conscious choice not to turn that story into a spectacle. The ride was scheduled for the early morning hours, not out of excessive secrecy, but for practicality, less traffic, fewer stares, fewer questions. Hours earlier, Mark had received one last call from an unknown number. He answered. "Some stories come back," said the voice from the other end. "Even when you try to bury them," Mark replied without raising his voice. "Some stories only survive when they are buried properly." The call dropped. Everything was aligned. The pieces were fitting together. The past had been acknowledged. The present was being organized. The future was about to be defined. The Porsche wouldn't roar in a noisy climax. It wouldn't floor it on an open road. Its final moment would be silent, controlled, and definitive. And paradoxically, it would be there, in absolute silence, that his story would reach its highest point. Dawn arrived without drama, no sirens, no visible hurry, just the distant sound of tires occasionally passing on the main road and the dense silence that precedes irreversible decisions. The transport truck arrived exactly on schedule. It had no flashy logos, nor did it look like a vehicle specializing in luxury cars. It was too ordinary to arouse curiosity, an intentional choice. The driver got out, confirmed documents, exchanged a few words with Mark. Nothing more than necessary. The Porsche remained motionless in the garage, under the same dim light. For the first time since 1989, it wouldn't move on its own. Mark opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. Not to drive, just to be there. The analog dashboard stared back at him with its almost disarming simplicity. He turned the key one last time. The engine roared to life with the same restrained, steady, predictable sound. No hesitation, no misfires. 35 years of functional silence summed up in that instant. Daniel watched from the outside. He didn't approach. He didn't touch the car. He knew that any further gesture would transform the moment into something he had spent his entire life avoiding: sentimentality. The Porsche slowly moved toward the truck's platform. It climbed effortlessly, as if this were just another ordinary journey. There was no audience, no cameras. The climax unfolded away from prying eyes, exactly as that car had always been intended. When the engine was turned off, something came to a definitive end. While the technicians were securing the vehicle, Mark noticed a discreet movement at the end of the street. A car parked with its engine running, headlights off. It wasn't a coincidence. It never was. The climax would not come in the form of a physical confrontation, but of a decision made under pressure. The truck driver was waiting for the final signal to leave when a man approached. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He didn't identify himself as an authority figure. He spoke softly, too confident to be a curious onlooker. "Last chance," he said, looking at the Porsche already strapped to the platform. "Some stories can still be reinterpreted." Daniel stepped forward. For the first time since the beginning of it all, he spoke before Mark. "This car never told stories," he said. "It just drove through them." The man assessed the two for a few seconds. There was no explicit threat, just calculation. He realized what was before him, not a negotiable item, but a decision already made. "Once this leaves here, it's not coming back," he said. Mark replied calmly, "It was never meant to be a return trip." The man nodded, turned around, and disappeared into the darkness. The car parked at the end of the street drove away soon after. The truck closed the platform. The metallic sound echoed briefly and then dissolved into the silence of the early morning. The driver got into the cab and waited for the final signal. Daniel looked at the Porsche one last time. There was no exaggerated emotion on his face, just a kind of quiet relief, like someone who has completed a mission too long to be celebrated. "He did exactly what he needed to do," he said, "and now he's going to rest." Mark signaled. The truck drove off. The climax wasn't noisy. There was no chase. There was no public revelation. But at that moment, something fundamental happened. A story that could have been distorted, exploited, or turned into a spectacle was concluded in the only coherent way possible. In the silence of the empty street, Mark felt the complete transformation. He was no longer just an appraiser. He was someone who had learned that the true value of certain things lies in knowing when to take them out of circulation. Daniel, for his part, seemed lighter, as if part of his constant vigilance had been switched off along with the Porsche's engine. The central conflict was resolved not through exposition, but through the conscious control of that story's destiny. And for both of them, that was the greatest victory possible. The following days passed without incident. No unexpected calls, no news circulating in obscure forums or specialized auctions. The 1989 Porsche had disappeared from the visible world exactly as it had always lived, without leaving any obvious trace. For Mark, the silence was disconcerting at first. His professional routine had always been marked by objective completions, contracts signed, evaluations delivered, values defined. This time there was none of that, just the strange feeling that something important had been done without his name being associated with it. He returned to the office and resumed dealing with common cases. Modern SUVs, predictable supercars, collectibles laden with marketing. Everything seemed noisier than before, not worse, just excessive. Mark realized he had changed his own criteria for relevance. Not every rare car mattered, not every story needed to be amplified. Daniel, on the other hand, was experiencing something he hadn't felt in decades: lightness. The house seemed bigger, the garage too empty, but not incomplete. He began to fill the space with simple tasks. He tidied up old boxes, donated tools, and discarded parts he had kept as a precaution for years. The past no longer weighed on him. One morning, Daniel took Thomas for a walk around the neighborhood. They didn't talk about the car, they talked about the future, postponed trips, simple plans, ideas that never found a place while the Porsche was still under his silent responsibility. Thomas realized something important. His father wasn't getting rid of a part of himself. He was finally allowing himself to exist without her. A few weeks later, Mark received a letter with no return address. Inside, just a simple card with a short sentence. Preservation is also a form of truth. No signature, no explanation. Mark didn't try to find out the origin. He didn't need to. He understood exactly what it meant. The historical archive that received the Porsche never released complete technical details. The car came to exist only as an internal reference, accessible to a few researchers under strict terms. It was not exhibited, it was not photographed, it was not celebrated. He was fulfilling his ultimate purpose, to remain true to himself, beyond the reach of opportunistic narratives. Over time, rumors began to circulate, as always happens when something valuable disappears without explanation. Some said the car had never existed. Others claimed it had been deliberately destroyed. There were even theories that it was all just a strategy to inflate the price of another similar model. Daniel never responded to any of that. Neither did Mark. The outcome of that story no longer belonged to them. Months later, Mark turned down a new case. A client wanted to appraise a car with a sensitive history, offering a significant bonus to expedite the process. For the first time in his career, Mark said no without a technical justification. He simply didn't accept. He understood that he had learned something that wasn't in any professional manual. Some stories require boundaries, not exposure. Daniel started driving a different car, a regular sedan, discreet and comfortable. Nobody gave him a second glance. He liked that. Each trip was now just a trip, not under constant surveillance. In a casual conversation, Thomas asked if his father missed the Porsche. Daniel thought for a few seconds before answering. "No," he said, "I miss the weight he carried, and that's something I've left behind." The ending didn't bring any public revelations or spectacular plot twists. It brought something rarer, coherence. To those who never knew its history, the 1989 Porsche remained just an ordinary car from that era, and that's exactly what it always needed to be. The true conclusion lay not in the vehicle's physical fate, but in the silent transformation of the people who crossed its path. None of them emerged unchanged. None of them needed to be recognized for it. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. A seemingly ordinary car was the catalyst for extraordinary decisions, not because of what it displayed, but because of everything it never needed to reveal. The story ended without applause, without headlines, without an audience. It ended in the only way possible for something that had always lived on the fringes of attention, in silence. Years later, the Porsche still roams the same American roads, now with its odometer showing numbers that few would believe to be real. It hasn't become a museum piece, nor a collector's trophy displayed under spotlights. It remains discreet, almost invisible to those who don't know what to look for. For some, it's just a well-preserved classic car. For others, it's a survivor from an era when driving meant feeling every vibration of the machine. Its history isn't written on plaques or in million-dollar auctions, but in the silence of its engine and the respect of those who know its past. If this story changed the way you see classic cars, leave a comment telling us what surprised you the most. Do you believe that machines like these should be kept in storage or continue running, accumulating real stories? Share this content with other car enthusiasts who value the past more than status. Here, every detail matters. Every model has a hidden story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new narratives about ordinary cars that carry extraordinary trajectories. Activate the bell, participate in the conversation, and help keep alive the stories that don't appear in advertisements but deserve to be told.